So today we are going to go through Jacques Derrida's 1966 essay titled Structure, Sign, and Play. This was originally given in 1966 at Johns Hopkins University as a lecture, and I think Derrida was actually a replacement, a substitute teacher for someone who was originally going to give a lecture, and it just so happened that Derrida gave one of the most groundbreaking lectures in the 60s and completely reshaped Western thought after that and influenced so many different discourses. And so we're going to go through this in a series of parts. This is going to be the first of likely 4 to 6 parts where we're going through the entirety of the essay. And we're not necessarily going to go through it in sequential order. So I do plan to hit every single concept, and I'll paste the relevant text on the screen so we can read through it together and then we can go through it. But the main thing is that we hit every relevant concept, because I think that if you read the lecture in the order that it's written, Derrida starts off not explaining any of his terms. He does not give you that grace to explain it. He sort of assumes you're well aware of a ton of philosophers. I mean, he's talking about the entirety of the Western tradition, from Plato up until Aristotle. From Plato up until, I guess, Heidegger, Nietzsche, up until that point. So you have to know the history of Western thought very deeply. And you have to also know how Heidegger used a lot of terms, because Derrida's playing off of them. And so if you were to read it, he starts off with extremely abstract concepts immediately. I mean, he starts talking about a rupture, and you're like, what is a rupture? What does he mean by that? And it doesn't make sense because he's trying to disrupt the linear way of thinking about history. But he doesn't explain that in the entrance of the essay. And so I'm going to go through the concepts that I think are more concrete. They have more practical examples than more concrete examples, which is why we're skipping down a couple pages so that we can get to those parts. Okay, so let's go through the structure of the video. So part 1, we're going to have a little intro and we're going to read through the text. And again, the text that we are reading from is cropped from about the 3rd page it should be if you read this in its essay format. And as we read the text, you're going to see pretty clearly that he's listing 3 philosophers as 3 examples of ruptures in the history of thought. And by understanding how they are ruptures, we're going to understand a lot of the key terms that he employs, like center, presence, decentering, and so on. So let's begin reading the text. Where and how does this decentering, this thinking, the structurality of structure occur? It would be somewhat naive to refer to an event, a doctrine, or an author in order to designate this occurrence. It is no doubt part of the totality of an era, our own, but still it has always already begun to proclaim itself and begun to work. Nevertheless, if we wish to choose several names as indications only, and to recall those authors in whose discourse this occurrence has kept most closely to its most radical formulation, we doubtless would have to cite the Nietzschean critique of metaphysics, the critique of the concepts of being and truth, for which were substituted the concepts of play, interpretation, and sign without present truth. The Freudian critique of self-presence, that is, the critique of consciousness, of the subject, of self-identity, and of self-proximity or self-possession, and more radically, the Heideggerian destruction of metaphysics, of ontotheology, of the determination of being as presence. But all these destructive discourses and their analogues are trapped in a kind of circle. The circle is unique. It describes the form of the relation between the history of metaphysics and the destruction of the history of metaphysics. Okay, so let's go through it. So what is he saying here? Well, basically, he's saying that we can't refer to this as an event, as something that took place, because it has always been taking place. And he says that pretty explicitly. He says, but still, it has always already begun to proclaim itself and begun to work. But he says, nevertheless, we're going to choose a few key names in order to show how what has always been at play, this decentering process, has been done by philosophers who we consider radical, like Nietzsche, Heidegger, and Freud, who have completely disrupted the structure of thought, of the foundation that we thought was so stable. They removed it, and maybe it got replaced by something else, which is in part a part of a broader point that he's going to make later, but that's neither here nor there right now. What we're going to focus on right now is why he's choosing these three philosophers and why he's so interested in them as occurrences in the structurality of structure that he is going to point out. Okay, so now we're really getting in the sauce. So you're probably looking at the screen and you're like, what the hell is this? Well, I think this is the best diagram that I could think of to describe and visualize what Derrida is talking about here. So let me just describe the diagram first, and then I'll fill it in and we can use it functionally so that hopefully that'll help get a better understanding. But for now, let's just describe the diagram as best I can, and hopefully once we go through the examples, you can go back and read the section what we were talking about, and hopefully it will make more sense to you. So just looking at this diagram, you can see it's a triangle. And the basic idea is the top of the triangle is the foundation of whatever structure of thought that we're using as an example. So we'll call that the center. And then we have a middle section where we can think of the middle section sort of sprouting from the center, from the foundation. And then we have the bottom section where you can think of it as like sort of like appearances maybe, where it's more the more surface level thing sprouting from the center. The X's we have there are signifiers. So a signifier, you can think of it as literally anything. If you know what a signifier is, I'm using it in the sense that Ferdinand de Saussure used it. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. Which is just anything that signifies a signified, right? So we're thinking about it in its written form, and I'm just putting an X to represent anything, any signified. But the point is that in principle, there are signifiers there, right? So let's say we put the top signifier as God, and let's see that structure quickly. Alright, so let's look to the right side first of the triangle. Now we filled it in with some things. So now you can see at the center, at the foundation, at the top, we put God. And the arrow on the side makes it clear that these are the things that come from God, right? So you have the values come from God. They have their grounding in the foundation, God. And then the values govern life. And this is how Nietzsche viewed the structure of Christianity. So he diagnosed that the foundation of values for almost the entire history of man has been some transcendent force, what we call God, especially in Christianity. And this goes into his diagnosis of the impending or already here nihilism, where we live in a stage where post-enlightenment, post-reason, where the values are now free-floating because God is put into question. So that's where you get his famous quote, "God is dead, we have killed him." And I'm not going to get into an argument with a bunch of Nietzscheans about exactly what he means here, but let's read a quote from The Will to Power, where he says, "What does nihilism mean? That the highest values devalue themselves. The aim is lacking. Why? Finds no answer." So what Nietzsche sees as nihilism is the highest values devaluing themselves. Well, what does that mean? Well, if we look at the structure, what it means is that when you get rid of the foundation, when the foundation is put into questions, the values themselves devalue themselves, not in that any particular person is attacking the structure, but that we just find ourselves in a cultural moment where the transcendent foundation that was holding together this entire triangle is now getting put into question. And if the foundation is getting put into question, well, the values now seem like they're free floating. That's when people say, well, now anything can be anything. Well, now everything's subjective. And now people find themselves, and this is the key point that Derrida is trying to point out, that what Nietzsche pointed out was that now people find themselves in an era where you look down and you can't find your footing. You can't put values in some transcendent justification. This isn't just God that Nietzsche is diagnosing. He's diagnosing a much broader thing. He's saying our values, what we attach to life, is itself immanent in life. It doesn't come from anything transcendent. And that's the radical deflooring that Nietzsche provided to us. Okay, so God decentered. So if you look at the visual, I removed God from the top because we've removed God, culturally speaking, according to Nietzsche. And I've replaced the word values that was there in the middle of the triangle with just signifiers, 3 X's. And that sort of goes to show that the signifiers can mean anything. And so what we're saying here in the chart is that now that God is being decentered or removed as center, now there's a question of does God even govern what governs values, if not God? And does that mean that all values are subjective? We can choose whatever we want? And so the point is not that Derrida is a subjectivist. The point is that Nietzsche decentered the structure that existed before he diagnosed what was occurring, right? The structure was the Christian sort of system where you had God as transcendent above life, and he dictated and created the values that govern human activity in life. But now that there is no God, what does that reveal? Well, I put a quote that I think is like something that Derrida would say, even though it's not directly from Derrida. So it says, God was decentered, revealing that the signifier is not only able to shift, but the very structure of a center is unstable. And so what that means is that now that we removed God, it doesn't just mean that, for Derrida, that we've chosen the wrong foundation. Maybe the foundation is some sort of naturalist explanation or a physicalist explanation or an idealist explanation. No, that's not what Derrida is saying. He's saying the very concept of a center is always being decentered. That's why he refers to these moments of philosophers decentering as an occurrence, as a rupture, because he doesn't want to make it seem like they started this. Because his point is that it's always been occurring. It's just how language functions. We necessitate, I guess we don't necessitate in like a sort of logical necessity, but sort of our language and our societies are always structured by centers, sort of pragmatically. That's just how it's always been. And this shows a much more fundamental issue between how the signifier and the signified structure is set up that Derrida points out. That's for a next video, because it's more abstract to get into something like that. But the point then is that in principle, the X's can mean anything now. And this is what Derrida means by play. By play, we can think of the X's always being in this sort of movement where they're being replaced by new and new X's, producing new and new meanings. That also applies to the center, because the center is an X. And the center, the triangle, the structure, the very thing that tries to stabilize and create a hierarchy is a sort of illusion. It exists temporarily to try to stabilize the play. Okay, so now that we went through that, I want you to quickly just look at this chart once again and see if it makes a little bit more sense now until before we go on to the next one. So in the top left we have our key terms, center, presence, and play, which I'm hoping that you'll have better understanding by the end of this video. And so at the top we have the center, of course we have it's not filled in with a specific center. And in the middle is where I really want you to pay attention. So you have the X's, which are the signifiers, right? And the key point is that whatever we fill the middle with in, I want you to have the idea that the triangle is there to stabilize the play. So on the left side and on the right side, we have other signifiers, showing that they're always capable of coming in and changing the structure, right? So just keep this in mind, because the X's also apply to the top part on the center. So now on to the next example. So Freud, Sigmund Freud. So how did he decenter a structure, as Derrida would say? Well, think about how we normally think about consciousness, just conventionally. We usually think of ourselves as fully in control of our actions, right? We usually don't, at least I'm talking about just generally in the culture today, and I don't really see a point in history where we didn't view it this way, where we think of ourselves as a stable subject, an actual existent subject that persists in time, right? Capable of making decisions, and normally fully in control. We like to say, I decided to do this, right? Why do you like that? Well, I chose to do that. And so the old sort of structure of consciousness was as follows on the screen. You have, as the center at the top, you have the conscious subject. And then from there, the conscious subject reasons about things, right? And then the conscious subject comes to moral conclusions, or we can put at the bottom other things like decisions, or just anything that you can think of that would be derivative of the subject, and which makes us seem present. Derrida would say the subject seems present. They seem evident, apparent, fully here, right? They're not destabilized. They are in a sense a sort of unified object, fully present to us, and determined and capable of being in control, capable of making willful decisions. But so what does Freud do? Well, Freud is famous for talking about the unconscious. So what he did that destabilized thought was that he showed that the unconscious, in large part, is what's in control here. So he sort of flipped things. Well, he said, well, we thought that the subject was fully in control for the most part, or overwhelmingly present to us, overwhelmingly a stable subject. But what he says is, he's like, no, actually, we are driven by a bunch of unconscious forces, many of which we can't recover, and they govern and create the ego. The ego then becomes a derivative of the unconscious structure. And then the superego, that moral the ego that we're partially aware of. And so he destabilized the subject as center. Now we're on to the goat himself. I mean, the battle of the goats, it has to be between Heidegger and Derrida for me. So, but this explanation of Heidegger is not going to do him justice. I mean, I apologize in advance for how I'm going to have to structure sort of his reversal of God being. But regardless of the fact, I just want to say that for any hardcore Heideggerians watching this. But it serves a functional purpose. Hopefully you'll be able to understand. So let's get into it. Let's look at the diagram on the screen now. So what is at the center? Well, God. Let's look at Thomas Aquinas, for example, who says God is pure act. God is being itself. So Aquinas turned being into a center, right? From God, you have substances and then creations. You have those substances being actualized into created beings. And so for Aquinas and the tradition that viewed being as the highest being, that structure which Heidegger calls ontotheology, which is that tradition of treating being itself as a being. And God was that. And man, I hope that whoever's watching this has a familiarity with Heidegger so you can understand what I'm saying. If you haven't studied Heidegger, you're going to be like, what are you talking about? Well, basically, you should understand the structure of what I'm talking about right now. There is a center for the history of the West. Heidegger is saying that the history of the West has forgotten what being actually is. They've forgotten the question of being. And it's been obscured by treating being as a individual thing, as a highest being or a super being. It's one that governs and stabilizes over all other beings. So you can think of God being itself, the ground of all being, the ground of all existence, the foundation, the stable, fixed center, governing all of created existence, all of individual beings. So all individual beings get their foundation. Think about it in the Leibnizian sense, principle of sufficient reason, which Heidegger talks about. They sort of have a rational principle. They have a rational order, a unified whole, something that can be traced back to its center. Okay, so now we're on to how Heidegger flipped things. And again, I'm sorry for having to frame it in this hierarchical structure. But as we'll see later, Derrida argues that all of our language needs to be out of that structure. Not because I want to speak that way, but because the way that the structure of language is ordered is that such that the signifier is contrasted with the signified. So we have the signifier and the signified, and that's the order of hierarchy. It all starts off with the signifier appearing as signified. Anyways, what did he flip here? Well, Heidegger said, well, let's not treat being as an individual being. Let's treat being as something else, something more fundamental, which is why Heidegger specified that what he was doing is he called it fundamental ontology, not phenomenology. Although, I mean, lots of people are going to say he was doing a type of phenomenology. But regardless, he put being, the question of being, back in the air, and he wanted to emphasize that being isn't anything static, which is why the chart is kind of misleading, because the chart shows that the center is static. But this would be a mischaracterization of Heidegger. But the only reason we're framing it this way is to show that he sort of flipped the binary here, where God, or a thing, individual being, was put at the center as a super being to govern all the rest of the beings that were lower. But now Heidegger says, well, let's talk about being, but it is not a foundation. It is something that is shifting. It's able to reveal itself in different ways at different epochs. So what being is changes. And so what he did is that he destabilized this seeming ground of being. He showed us that being isn't actually a fixed, stable thing which guarantees the stabilization of meanings. Actually, being is something that in its very essence is always changing, that it's always shifting, and it's always revealing things. What maybe you want to think of it in a theological sense, created things as contingent. not necessarily contingent on a foundation, because the very foundation is what he called an unground. It is a non-foundation. It is a shifting sort of, think of it as like a bubble that doesn't have any specific color, but it always reveals individual objects in different colors. And so the bubble is a sort of ground, but it's a sort of unground because it's always shifting. And so he destabilized the center, right, which was the onto-theological tradition of treating an individual being as a super being that governs and guarantees meaning. This even applies to a sort of naturalist explanation, where we think, well, being, let's just say existence, things as they are themselves stable objects waiting to be revealed in the way that they just are. And through sort of scientific exploration, we can uncover reality. We can uncover being in its stable essence. We can recover the essence of reality, and that essence is stable. And this goes into what Heidegger calls inframing and the technological era, where being has revealed itself not as necessarily God, but still onto-theological, where we think we can uncover, sort of like end all of philosophy, where we can uncover being itself in itself as it reveals itself as a stable, fixed reality. But Heidegger's saying that's not true, which again is why this chart is misleading, but I hope you understand now why I had to frame it that way. So as you look at the chart, it should make a little bit more sense to you now. Well, there's a triangle, right? The center is sort of the stabilizer of all of the things that are derivative from the center. And the thing that Derrida has been pointing out is that throughout history, there have been occurrences of philosophers who have showed the sort of contingency of the center, the ability of it to shift and move around, and people argue over them. And this is what 99% of discourse is about, is people arguing over the center, what's foundational. This is, for Derrida and Heidegger, this is all of metaphysics. They are trying to find the highest being, what Derrida calls the transcendental signified, in order to stabilize meaning, in order to stabilize the structure. For Heidegger, they are treating individual beings as God, and those individual beings, or maybe the scientism that exists today, treats reality as a fixed thing that is stable and we're able to uncover. It stabilizes meaning. And so in that sense, you can see why Heidegger is highly relevant to Derridians. Derrida tells you explicitly that he got his concept, or his idea of deconstruction, as an extension of Heidegger's destruction. If you read Heidegger, you know what I'm talking about with the term destruction. And so what is Derrida telling us here? Because from these examples, you may say, okay, well, I understand that the centers are being decentered. I understand what that means now. I understand what presence means. I understand a little bit what play means. But isn't Derrida just showing us that some philosophers were wrong about the center of reality? Well, no. What Derrida is arguing is similar to what Heidegger argued. There is no ground. And that's why as we said earlier, the diagram was a little bit misleading, because there is no ground for Heidegger. The ground is always shifting, which is why in his later work he even wanted to move away from Dasein as a center. He didn't want to make it seem like Dasein is that which grounds being revealing itself. And so Derrida's radicalness is going to come in really in these next couple episodes that I will create, where he's going to demonstrate that the play of signification occurs without a ground. The ground is the play itself, through signifiers being next to each other, always shifting, always changing the triangle structure that to us seems stable. It's the play of signifiers that creates the illusion of a ground. And then from there we try to argue over what is the essential ground. So that will be in the next video. Hopefully you stick around from this one on to the next one so you can see we're going to sort of ramp up the technicality and the radicalness of Derrida's critique.